Welcome everybody to the University of Michigan Press AMS book party. I'm really excited to be here with all of you and to celebrate new books about music. If you are participating in AMS and you haven't checked out our book exhibit, please do it. And even if you're not participating in AMS, you can use our conference discount, which I'm hoping Sean will share in the chat when he gets a minute. I am Sarah Cohen, and I'm acquiring editor for American Studies, Music, and Media Studies at University of Michigan Press. I took over the music list a little over a year ago when Mary Frances left the press to start a new post as director at Penn Press. And it's been an absolute treat to get to take over Mary's list and to get to know her authors, which all of you are. And I'm grateful for the work she did to acquire the books that we're going to be talking about today. So Sean and I put this event together because I wanted to do something that could only work in the virtual format. We've all been kind of stressed out about virtual format, and I was trying to think about what's a cool thing that we could do that we wouldn't be able to do normally. And our authors metaphorically speak to each other by being included as part of the same publishing program, but rarely get to actually speak to each other. So I thought it would be fun to get a bunch of our recent authors in one room to talk about their work. And for me, it's part celebration, it's part salon, and it's part living book exhibit. So thank you for being here and participating in this. So today we're going to hear how wide-ranging our music publishing program is at Michigan. We'll hear from authors who write about a range of sounds, time periods, and geographical locales. We'll hear from authors whose books are available in open access digital format on our Fulcrum platform. And we'll hear from folks whose work has been published as part of our Tracking Pop series like AD and part of our Music and Social Justice series. And I think we have Stephen and Heather and Annegret and Michael from that series, which is super exciting. So we're gonna go, we're gonna ask two authors to speak 2 minutes about your project, and then we'll pause in case anybody has questions. And if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat. I'm a person who loses my question if I can't get it out immediately. So feel free to do that, and we'll take them as we go. So the first person up is Kyle Barnett, who's the author of Record Cultures, The Transformation of the US Recording Industry.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to everyone at University of Michigan Press, and I'm honored to be with this group of authors. Thanks all. I come at music from a media studies point of view, so I'm always trying to get the two disciplines to talk to one another. And my research is about the U.S. recording industry between around 1920 and 1935. This is a period in which a bunch of new kinds of music are being recorded for the first time. A bunch of record labels are emerging for the first time. And it's all quite provisional. They're making it up as they go along, recording what is near them and then seeing what works. But what I think, what I try to do in the book is map how these emerging record labels packaged what became the genres of jazz, blues, and country. And so looking at the A&R, proto A&R people, the talent scouts, the musicians, the press accounts, and accounts from fans when they're available, looking at the sort of emergence, this exponential expansion of the recording industry during this period. And then by the late 20s and early 30s, the second half of my book is really about the ways in which the recording industry becomes inextricably linked to both the radio and film industries. In fact, becoming a subsidiary of radio in a lot of ways by the early 1930s. You might think about it as, radio being the streaming apps of 1933. It was that sort of dramatic transformation. I'm also really trying to map the way in which race, class, gender, geographical concerns also get mapped onto these categories as, again, very provisional during that period, but long-lasting in terms of social impacts. And in a lot of ways, the categories reified divisions already within U.S. society. So, so trying to get media industry research to talk about the recording industry, trying to historicize popular music studies in relation to the recording industry, and I have a couple other mini projects baked in there too. So I don't want to
So
overstay my talk. You know, professors are known for talking too long. So
no, I think that was a perfect introduction, and I think from the sort of codification of genres in the early recording industry, we can turn over to Carl Wojdeck on Charlie Parker. And this book, we wanted to do a new edition of it this year to get out in time for Parker's centennial. So go ahead, Carl.
Just what I was going to say, this is the centennial year of Charlie Parker, and it was a pleasure to revise my 1996 book, taking into account all kinds of new research that has surfaced, new music that has resurfaced. It may seem strange that Parker, who died in 1955, so what is that, 65 years ago or something, new recordings keep resurfacing or surfacing of Charlie Parker. In fact, maybe 3 months ago, a new interview with Charlie Parker on the telephone that was recorded surfaced. So there's a lot of new material out there to talk about. Many of you may know the structure of my book starts off with a biographical section, and then it goes into a semi-chronological study of his music with a lot of transcriptions. And in revising the book, not only did I take into account new research, in fact, ironically, I mean, when my book was published in 1996, I almost started revising it then. I started compiling lists of new ideas, corrections, and things like that. What I found in revising this book is that I've changed quite a bit. Since I wrote this book, I spent very little time thinking about Charlie Parker. Although I'm a saxophonist, I spent my scholarship in Duke Ellington, John Coltrane. Currently, I'm working on a Miles Davis article. But when I came back to Parker, I was just so blown away by not only his brilliance, but I really had to revise some of my thoughts about Parker's last 5 years, which were somewhat tragic in some ways. His health deteriorated. His life was often in greater turmoil. And yet, partly because of newly issued Charlie Parker live recordings and alternate takes, I was able to really see a new freshness, or at least new vitality. And so I really reevaluated his last 5 years. And it was a real pleasure to do that, because Parker was a genius. Parker, if you listen to him, he takes you through all kinds of emotions, a unique artist. And it was just a pleasure to reassess Charlie Parker's legacy. After all, he created a language. And in the last 5 years, he exploited that language in a very, very beautiful way that was a great eye-opener for me, and I hope will be for readers of the book.
Great, awesome. I'm not seeing any questions other than Charles's question, which Kyle answered and told us he's like a record gatherer rather than a collector.
yeah,
But
I don't have. I'm not all that purposeful. You know, it's happy accidents left and right, I would say.
and since we started a couple minutes late, I think we're just gonna keep rolling. So if you have questions, keep them coming. But next up, I'm going to ask Stephen Miller to speak to us about Sounding Dissent, Rebel Songs, Resistance, and Irish Republicanism. And I want to say that this is the first book that we published in our Music and Social Justice series. So it's a great distinction for Stephen's book to have. And we're proud to have all of your books on the list, actually, but proud to have this as the first in that series.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks for organising this with Sean. I hope you can all understand my accent. I'll try and speak as slowly as possible and enunciate wherever I can. So this book, Sounding Dissent, is basically, it looks at how Irish Republicans have used music, and particularly political songs, as a means to resist against the hegemonic power of the British state from the late 18th century up to the present. And it does this primarily by focusing on what are called Irish rebel songs, and it uses these as a platform or a lens through which to explore and understand the history of political violence in Ireland. So for those not familiar with this particular type of music, Irish rebel songs are a subgenre of Irish folk music that focus on the exploits of Irish Republican revolutionaries, and these are both real and imagined exploits. As you might expect, the rebel song scene, the rebel songs were written and consumed by a broad range of people, but I'm most interested in the ones that are still circulating today amongst Irish Republicans. And at these sort of performances or gigs, they sort of range from, say, 20 people to 2,000 people. And these people go there as a way to sort of listen to these songs and sort of learn their history through these songs, and engage in acts of sort of ritualistic resistance. So here in Ireland, in the north of Ireland, in Belfast, armed conflict has all but ended, but there are still raw wounds, if you like, and these songs become a mechanism for people to sort of gather around in order to articulate and perform and express their political opinions and beliefs. And although I approach the topic from the present, it's important to understand the past in these songs, as I said, because they're often used for their educational value, at least by some people. And so, like most revolutionary movements, Irish republicanism is full of splits and schisms. And what you find is that Irish rebel songs have been used by Irish Republicans as a way to sort of stitch together and claim legitimacy over certain historical periods, and sort of to lay claim to the Republican mantle. And this happens through other sort of cultural mechanisms as well, like mural art on the side of walls, and newspapers and other, and poetry and whatnot. But my focus is really on these political songs. I should stress though that the singing of these songs, it's often as much for their entertainment value as well as their sort of propaganda role, and they really seek to propagate for this goal of a united Ireland, a 32 county Irish Republic, free from British control. So thematically, I think it connects with some of what's been discussed in the series. If geographically it's slightly off the end.
Awesome, thank you, Stephen. And I see we have a question from Annegret, and we'll get to that after the next person who I'd like to speak, who is Mimi. If you're ready, Mimi Hadden is the author of What is Post-Punk, Genre and Identity in Avant-Garde Popular Music, 1977 to 1982.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. I was a bit kind of late to the party because I kind of fell off the email list for some reason, but I'm happy to be here. It's really nice to kind of meet you all. Here's my book, What is Post-Punk? So the book uses post-punk and uses theories of genre to kind of mutually kind of elucidate each other. So I ask genre, what is post-punk? And I ask post-punk, what is genre, if that makes sense. The book it doesn't offer a kind of concrete definition of what post-punk actually is. It rather kind of feels around the borders of like where, what are its boundaries? What is post-punk in relation to new wave? What is post-punk in relation to punk? What is its relation to kind of other popular musics at the time? So disco or dub reggae, for example. So I was really interested in the idea. I was really interested in post-punk because it's not a genre that necessarily has a coherent kind of set of musical stylistics, or it doesn't really have a kind of coherent musical style. It's quite a kind of eclectic sounding genre. So if it doesn't have a kind of coherent sound, as it were, then what is the thing that's holding it together? So I spent, the bulk of the research is reading the music press, primarily in the UK, but also to some extent in the United States, to try and kind of figure out what are the discursive themes that hold this thing together, that is post-punk. And I was also, and this touches on Kyle's research interest as well, I was also interested in what is post-punk's relationship to things, particularly like race and gender. I think post-punk has a really interesting relationship to Black associated musics, because in the discourse, Black music figures as a kind of cultural capital. So a kind of way for kind of white experimental musicians to have some kind of cachet or have some kind of kudos. So that's a really interesting kind of power relationship that I was interested in elucidating in the book. I kind of broadly conclude that post-punk is more about, it's more a kind of dispositional thing. It's more about showing one's taste, one's symbolic capital, rather than a kind of particular set of sonic characteristics. Yeah, so.
Thank you so much, Mimi, and sorry publicly that you got dropped off the email list. I'm really happy that you're here. And thank you to both you and Stephen for bringing your books, because I originally thought of this party as the bring your own book party. So thank you. Thank you for helping me live my dreams out. All right, so we have a couple of questions. Wow, we have a bunch of questions. So let's see. There's 2 questions I'm seeing for Stephen. I'm going to ask them both together because maybe they'll be answered together. One is from anonymous attendee who asks, are the songs of the Troubles recounted, reinvented by singers? Do you see adaptation and reference to current political situations? And the other question I'm seeing for Stephen is, do the songs that you write about, this comes from Annegret, who's on the panel, have a transnational presence, both in broad global terms and in the Irish diaspora?
Thanks very much. I'll answer I'll try to answer the first question first. So as to whether these songs are sort of readapted and reused, absolutely. And that has been the case over the sort of like 200-year period that these songs have been used. Quite often a song from a previous period will be used or implanted, if you like, within a fresh period of political and military, sometimes turmoil. That tends, sometimes what will happen is the same tune will be reused. In fact, oftentimes the same tune will be reused, and there are Republican revolutionaries such as James Connolly, who was executed in the 1916 Easter Rising. He's on record as saying that when he was writing these songs, he was deliberately using melodies from earlier revolutionary songs and then setting new lyrics to them, so as to sort of draw on that legacy of these songs and as to sort of like enrich the sort of the period that they were then taking part in. So absolutely, it's happened through time, and it continues to happen. I should say though that these songs have changed somewhat in their nature, because now, in the absence of direct conflict and violence, these songs have become more like musical museums, if you like, where people go in and sort of experience the past. And then sort of on a more entertainment level, there are some so-called dissident Republicans who continue to, target the police and British, as the symbolic representatives of the British state in Ireland, and sometimes are successful in killing them. And there are political groups that would sort of revolve around those military groups, who would have their sort of cultural movements, if you like, and would use rebel songs. But by and large, these songs have become much more entertainment value. And in terms of the international dimension, you see a lot of to and fro. So because things are much more static, if you like, within the rebel song scene here, my argument is that in order to fulfill their function as resistance music, they need to have something to resist against. And now that the people who were writing these songs and fighting against the British forces during the Troubles are in government, it's very difficult to do that now. So what they end up doing is appropriating other conflicts around the world, particularly in Palestine, and sort of like name checking these sort of groups and movements. And they don't play Palestinian music in Ireland in these settings, I think perhaps because of the language issues and whatnot, but they certainly use a lot of the iconography and try and really bring those two struggles together,
That's great. Thank you for answering those questions, Stephen. And there's another question from Salvatore Mora for you about how the political songs are perceived and received in the rest of the UK and certain extent of Europe, to a certain extent in Europe. And I think you touched on that in your answer to Anna Gret's question. So I'm going to move over to a couple of questions that we have for Mimi that I think work really well together. So one of them from an attendee is, what are the boundaries of music and social justice? Can post-punk be seen as a social justice movement? And then from Mike, do you want to unmute and ask your own question?
Sure. I mean, it's the corollary of that, right? I think it's actually a really nice compliment to music and social justice and punk music and the culture industry. I won't elaborate further.
Okay, the first question is enormous. What are the boundaries of music and social justice? I'm not sure that I can.
I don't think you have to answer that. I mean, but I think it would be good to hear your thoughts on, certainly the question of social justice and post-punk.
Yeah, so I wouldn't describe post-punk as a social justice movement. I wouldn't even describe it as a political movement. I mean, it has politicized elements. But I wouldn't say that post-punk had a particular political cause or one that was particularly clear. I suppose what's interesting about post-punk is the kinds of politicized allegiances that some of the bands made. So for example, performing at events like Rock Against Racism, aligning with the various kind of anti-fascist organizations in the late 1970s, because Britain in the 1970s saw a surge of popularity of like the National Front and other kind of fascist organizations. So, I think post-punk's kind of kinship or association with dub reggae could be read as a kind of way of resisting certain forms of racism in the United Kingdom in the late 1970s, but I don't think it was kind of, I wouldn't describe it as a social justice movement, and I don't think those priorities were particularly clearly articulated. I think it was more about kind of certain kinds of aesthetic interests. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the politics of it would fairly thin, and so for that reason I wouldn't describe it as a social justice movement.
Did you, Mimi, did you want to say anything about Mike's question about the culture industry?
I didn't quite hear it. I wonder if Mike could say it again, or maybe
Sure.
Tom.
Sure. This is name checking a mentor of mine from the art world, Tom Crow, who has this beautiful phrase that says, when you boil it down, the avant-garde functions primarily as a research arm for the culture industry. And what the examples sort of come, through the art line of, Dada collage into the Sex Pistols, into Vans, sneakers, MTV. And I was curious as a music person if you had a comment on that similar nexus.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And one of the things that I tried to challenge in the book, although maybe I could have made this clearer, is this kind of lineage, right? That there's this kind of like lineage of cutting edge experimental musicians who are kind of, a lot of the discourse around post-punk has kind of comes from the discourse around modernism, right? Kind of like progress, shock, and aesthetics that are kind of challenging aesthetics. And I think that is very much a kind of imposition of critics, which is as a way of kind of making this music fit a certain kind of musico-historical genealogy. And I kind of challenge that particularly in the final chapter of the book, where, I look at the way some of the critics describe these musicians' use of the synthesizer, particularly, that it's like, it's so, it's so out there, it's so avant-garde. It's like, well, there were plenty of kind of African-American musicians using the synthesizer at the same time. Do they not belong to the same lineage of a kind of like quasi-modernist history, if that makes sense? And I guess this is the kind of thing that Paul Gilroy challenges in his, Black Atlantic, when he's talking about this alternative story of modernism. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Great, thanks Mimi, and thanks Mike for that great question. I want to move on to our next two panelists. I'm seeing a Charlie Parker question, but I'm hoping that we'll have time to circle back to that. So the next person who I want to introduce is Danielle Lucier, who's the author of Music on the Move. And Sean, if you haven't already, I'm hoping you can share the link to the open access edition of that book, which is really rad and everybody should check it out.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for all your help in getting that book into the world. Music on the Move is trying to make accessible ideas that we think with all the time in our academic conversations, but ideas that are not always easy for people to grasp who are general readers or for undergraduates. And I'm thinking about them really in terms of threshold concepts. So people in literature talk about threshold concepts, these ideas that you think with that are tricky to grasp. And once you have them, you can think differently about all the new stuff you encounter. For Music on the Move, the threshold concepts in play are things like diaspora and colonialism, mediation, appropriation, mixing or hybridity, ownership, and globalization. So sometimes when we teach music, we teach it sort of nailed down to places. And this book is trying to not have that particular conversation about music is nailed down, but rather talk about the ways in which music moves between communities, between individuals, moves with migration, and the ways in which all of that movement then shapes a great deal of the music that we hear. And it moves through case studies. So there's no attempt to be comprehensive in treating a history of everything. But offering for diaspora case studies of African-American music and its various appropriations, the European appropriation of Romany music, or indeed Debussy's appropriation of Indonesian music. In thinking about mixed musics or musics that draw on multiple other source musics, using a lot of examples from contemporary composers like Hyoshin Na, Asha Srinivasan, Courtney Bryan, trying to highlight the ways in which individual musicians they don't stay stuck in a style or a complex of styles, but they are drawing freely on many different kinds of resources as they make new musics for themselves and for other people. So in essence, I'm trying to make some theoretical concepts easy enough for a general reader to grasp or for an undergraduate student to grasp so that they can then use those concepts when they encounter new music of various kinds. I am really, really proud of the fact that this book is open access, and that was made possible through a grant from Ohio State, through the library system. It's a tome grant, so toward an open monograph ecosystem. And I'm thankful to Michigan for making that so easy, because that's also part of the access that I'm after, trying to make these ideas available for lots and lots of different people to think with.
It was a pleasure to kind of get you to the finish line on this project, Danielle, and thank you for all the nice things that you say about the folks in Michigan. So the next person I want to introduce is A.D. Carson, who I had the pleasure of working with on his project, which is, as we like to say, is the first ever peer-reviewed rap album. It's a lot more than that, and I think it's a cool place to go after Danielle's project because he's also thinking a lot about place, and I think certainly mixing hybridity, diaspora, a lot of the themes that Danielle raises in her book come up in different ways in AD scholarship as well.
Thank you, Sarah. I also want to, there's the, if you're interested, you can just download it, but you can, there are these records that you can get, and I'm donating that money to make sure that some young musicians back in my hometown, Decatur, Illinois, have access to the kinds of resources that they might need to continue to do this, to make music or to be engaged in music in ways that aren't nearly as accessible as they should be. The project, I Used to Love to Dream started with, it actually started in 2017. I wrote Owning My Masters, The Rhetorics of Rhymes and Revolutions, and that was my dissertation. The album was part of an archive that had a whole bunch of stuff in it. And I realized that 34 tracks and a whole bunch of videos and fragments of text and all of that was far too much to expect that people would really engage with. While continually asking the question, why isn't it a book, or where is the book? And so after that, I wrote 2 mixtape essays called Sleepwalking. And while Owning My Masters was written in response to living in South Carolina at Clemson University, Sleepwalking Volume 1 was written in the time between leaving Clemson and coming to Charlottesville. Sleepwalking 2 was written while being in Charlottesville and attempting to ask again the same questions. And the 3rd installment of the Sleepwalking series was really asking these questions about myself and how estranged I feel from home, not just the specific place, Decatur, Illinois, but the idea, the memories, and then watching old films about my hometown and thinking that film does not describe the place where I grew up. And so what does memory do to revise the history of a place? And who has the authority to speak about the places that we come from? And I think that we know the answers to those questions, but this is also a way to answer the question about, well, what do genres tell us about the people who correspond or who we associate with those genres, and how it's this process that seems to be, it seems to be doing a whole lot of work that we don't even imagine that it's doing. And so even calling myself a rapper, as opposed to calling myself a scholar, calling myself a musician and not a rapper. I mean, all of these things change the way that people engage with me in the spaces where I'm now making music. So the project is asking, or at least like sort of standing in for lots of questions about citizenship, about justice, about home, about humanness, about memory, about place, like geospecificity. What is it like to be from the Midwest and not from Chicago? And why is it that all of the people in the Midwest, in folks' imaginations are white folks, and all of the people from Chicago in folks' imaginations are Black? All of these things. What does it mean to grow up in a place that's called the soybean capital of the world, but also have this story to tell through rap? So yeah, that's the short version.
Thank you, AD. I didn't realize that Decatur was the soybean capital of the world. I learned something.
Also the original home of the Chicago Bears, which were called the Decatur Staleys.
The Decatur what?
Staleys, because the agricultural firm Staley, like
okay.
the company, that was their team. And that was a thing.
That's sweet.
That's rad. Okay, so I see that we have Mike Figueroa here. He's in 2 places at the same time. He's also hosting a panel, chairing a panel at AMS. So I'm going to go ahead and let Mike and Annegret talk a little bit about their book, Performing Commemoration, so that Mike can go back to being in one place at once, and then we can take some questions.
So I'm starting to kick off. This is Performing Commemoration, a book that Mike Figueroa and I edited. It was a wonderful collaboration, I think, between our authors, Mike and me, to bring this book out. It started out as a conference in 2017 when UNC Chapel Hill put on the Defiant Requiem, which is a recreation of a apparent performance at Terezin that has become a commercial enterprise working through the travails of commemoration. I hope, Mike, that's a fair representation of this. And Mike and I were sitting over lunch at one point and going, this needs framing. And why don't you pick up from there?
Yeah, so thank you, Annegret. Your account is very accurate so far. Yes, so it was conceived initially as a conference that would lead to a publication that would, as Annegret put it, frame this and other types of commemorative performances that use reenactment frame them, rather contextualize them on a global scale. So we conceived it in the beginning as a bunch of really specific types of studies that would talk to each other. And we feel that they talk to each other really well in their written form. And that's a testament to all of the authors' commitment to collaboration as a working mode. This book really was not like, it wasn't, you know, two editors who went and solicited things. We workshopped all these papers together, and so we feel they hang together really well. And we're really grateful to Sarah and the editorial staff at Michigan for letting us work in that way and bring the volume out the way that we saw it. And you want to go over quickly some of the case, since you have the book in your hands, some of the various contributions?
Yeah, I was just thinking it would be good to sort of just outline a little bit where we are situated with the book. It's focused on the 20th and the 21st centuries. It's deliberately broad in terms of globe. We are actually, our authors get into 5 different continents and case studies. We have our contributors, just sort of to give an idea, besides Mike and me, are Philip Ballman, Noriko Manabe, Lillian Wall, Imani Mosley, Vanessa Anyu, Andrea Ballman, Sylvia Alajaji, Shekhi Ndaliko, and Kay Kaufman-Shalame wrote the afterword that sort of engaged with it all. We have contributions on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a wide range. And what was striking, Mike has already made that point, which is why we decided we had thought about from the get-go, this should become a publication. But once the conference happens, you reflect on it. But as the conference happened, our contributors were saying, wow, this is all connected. And this is as if we were writing for each other, in conversation with each other before we even met each other. And that is what then happened. We were saying, yes, this is so closely connected, so closely intersecting on these issues of how something in the act of reenactment and in the performance, in the musical performance. I mean, for us, it's very important to think in terms also of the sonic. Issues get reconfigured for the moment of the reenactment and the context of the reenactments. And that in itself is deeply political. One of the scariest things, I think, for both Mike and me, and I'll hand it right over, was that when the book came out, we were just saying it shouldn't be as relevant, but it still is. Mike?
Yes, no, and I think that will be a good place to leave you, is thinking about, especially this series, Music and Social Justice, is thinking about the vitality of humanities research right now, including music studies, but of course other approaches as well, to rethinking how this world looks and how it can look in the future through our scholarship. You know, I think the best public musicology is that which is committed to shaping a broader conversation about the issues that matter to us. And I think we've done that rather well as a collective group of authors in this volume. So thank you to the University of Michigan Press and its staff. This has been such a wonderful experience working with you all. You really let us do our best work, and we do our best. Rather, a way of putting it is, we've done our best work because of the way you've played your roles. So thank you very much.
Yeah, let me just round this off by saying that was my experience as well. I mean, it was fantastic working with you all from the moment that Mike and I were thinking about the series to holding the actual objects in our hands. And there were moments when I was just going, I don't know what to do with Fulcrum. And the staff was saying, let us help. And I thought that was great.
Well, I'm glad that my bribe worked and that you guys said some nice things about working with the press. And Mike, thanks for making time to come by. I'm seeing a couple questions for AD, and maybe we should take them. And I do want to make sure that I have time for our last two panelists. So I'll be watching the time as AD is talking, but I don't think it'll take up too long. So AD, I'm seeing two questions for you. One from an anonymous attendee who's asking, even though I used to love to dream is not primarily textual, do you think it was important for your academic career that it was packaged in a book-like form that is within ISBN by U of M Press? And would it count, presumably for tenure promotion reasons, if it was distributed as an album, not a book? And then another question from Danielle that's asking, who says, a wonderful aspect of your work is, actually I should just let Danielle ask this herself. Do you want to unmute so that I don't have to ventriloquize?
Sure, happy to. AD, a wonderful aspect of your work is that it deeply rethinks what's possible within a medium. It's more than a book, it's more than an album. Would you like to say more about how you developed this way of presenting your thinking?
Yeah, and I think that the answer to that question probably answers the other one as well. And that is, so I would love to say that I don't care what counts, because in a lot of ways I don't. And if if I'm up for tenure and then they say you don't belong here because instead of writing, whatever book or whatever number of articles you release 4 albums, then they're probably correct. I don't belong here because the way that I came here is from making the music that I make. And this also doesn't mean, and it's kind of absurd to think that someone might ask, and this was the question that was asked after my dissertation, is like, well, do you write? And of course, like, not only is it an absurd question, like we can kind of like dig and it wouldn't take a shovel to get to what's at the root of, like what's going on with that question. Also, Google is a thing. And so then you could find out the answer to that question. But because I think that books fail, or the books that I've read have failed to capture what albums do. And for that reason, I mean, I could write a book, and I've got a proposal for what I call a bad book, and it's a book that is going to fail because it's not an album. And so you can do all the things that you want to do in the classroom, or that you need to do in the classroom with that book, but the primary thing that you want to do with an album can't be done with that book. But then I get credit, and then I'd be fine for the things that, for the boxes that I might need to check off. I think that the folks here at the University of Virginia were really understanding of that. I think that it's a question that I've gone over with Lauren Kajikawa from the first meeting that we had together, and it's something that I talked to my colleagues here about, is that we just kind of have to, like, there is going to have to be some rethinking. This is not a new kind of rap album. It's just a rap album in a different context. And those materials that are there to help audiences like have something to engage with, so that they're not going into it without anything at all. But it developed because of the frustration of being in a doctoral program and thinking, I'm not going to make it through this program doing what I want to do, or I'm not going to pass these exams. My dissertation is not going to be accepted. And then going through and then thinking about the next question, how am I going to make it through being at a university? And at the point that that's no longer a possibility, then I'll ask those questions from outside of a university, if that is the bridge that I come to.
Thank you, AD. One of the things I always say about AD's project to people is that it's in better shape. When I saw the project, it was in better shape than any manuscript I've ever seen in my life. Although I haven't been in this field for that long, so that's an understatement, but a weird statement. But it's like the music making process, I think, involves so much peer review and so much listening and so much vetting and re-recording and rethinking as you go through it, I just think that like it's a model that maybe scholars could learn more from if they have the time and the energy to do that kind of sharing and listening, which so few people do anymore. So, all right, thank you, AD, and thanks for that great question, Danielle. I want to move on to our last two speakers, the first of whom is Heather Mclaughlin, who's the author of Singing Out, Gala Choruses, and Social Change. And as I mentioned earlier, this is also in our Music and Social Justice series.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Sean. I want to echo what other people have said. It's been wonderful to work with the professionals at the University of Michigan Press to bring out this book. This is a 10-year ethnographic study of Gala choruses. So Gala is spelled G-A-L-A, and that's an acronym. It stands for Gay and Lesbian Association of Choruses. So this is an umbrella organization that in North America represents more than 200 community choirs. These are staffed by amateurs or volunteers and directed by usually lowly paid artistic directors. And if you are interested at all in community arts organizations and their health and sustainability, I would encourage you to look at your local Gala chorus. There is going to be at least one if you live in a city of any size anywhere in North America. I know there's one in Brighton in the south of England, although LGBT choral musicking now happens all over the world. It's primarily an Anglophone phenomenon, and so it's in Europe, the UK, and in North America. I was really interested in these choirs because their mission statement that people in the organization quote constantly is changing the world through song. So here we have a musical organization that explicitly says they're committed to social justice and social transformation. And so what I wanted to find out was, how does that happen? So I looked at it in terms of race and gender, class, middle class norms and ethos was a particularly important theme that emerged. But this idea that what is it that we do when we sing songs in public? And so what these choirs are trying to do is to, and they say this constantly as well, change hearts and minds. The big argument of the book is that these choirs are best understood as part of two movements. One is the choral music scene, celebrating the Western choral music tradition. And then the other one is the gay rights movement. And really, we can't understand these choirs fully unless we see that they're committed to both of these. So when you think of it from the angle of the gay rights movement, as Stephen Miller mentioned, you know, all of these civil rights movements are divided at least into two groups. And these choirs come down on the side of what I decided to call integrationist activism. The people on the other side of the gay rights movement are much, much better represented in the academic literature. And they tend to be quite insulting, actually, to the folks on the side that I'm writing about. So to understand why they are changing hearts and minds and they say this too, in a non-confrontational way by singing their beautiful songs and trying to gently persuade you to be less homophobic, is to understand who they are. And so they are mostly my age. I'm 48 or older. They're mostly white. They are not people who call themselves queer, but rather gay or lesbian. And they are middle-class people who grew up in middle-class homes. That means that they sang in their church choirs and their school choirs. Lots of them have degrees in music. So they come from a place of really valuing a certain kind of music making and wanting certain kinds of possibilities that were foreclosed to them in their youth because of their sexual orientation. And so their priorities have been, for example, same-sex marriage and military service, the kinds of social justice issues that most people writing in queer studies find to be beside the point or even regressive. And yet here we have these choirs who not only sing songs about vague kind of progressive themes, but very specifically about those kinds of themes. In order to do so, they commission composers to create a lot of new music. So they're also actively building the choral canon while they're also attempting to transform their communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Heather. And last, I want to introduce Mike Mizells, who is going to talk about his book, In and Out of Phase, An Episodic History of Art and Music in the 1960s. He's got it.
Very quickly, I'm delighted to be on this panel with you all. I'm not a musicologist by training, PhD in art history, UVA, so UVA, great. This was a musical detour that took me into 1,000 different directions. So it began as a project when I was finishing up my dissertation actually on 1960s process artists, who told me during one of our last interviews that he had designed one of Philip Glass's first concert posters. And I thought, oh, this is a really interesting fact, but I didn't really have much to do with it. And started pulling on the thread, and for all kinds of reasons started hanging out with experimental composers, and we're sort of talking about minimalism and realizing that what I meant and what they meant were not really commensurate histories for reasons that didn't make sense to me, even though the artists and composers were all hanging out together. So the cover image is actually a sort of sketch work performed as a duet between Richard Serra, who's one of the most famous living sculptors, and Philip Glass, whose hands you can tell which is which. So thinking about how these histories fit and don't fit together through a series of case studies. This book has since taken me into 1,000 different strange directions. AD, I'd love to follow up with you separately, actually based on some things I was working on with this book. I actually wound up making a concept album with 2 younger members of 808 Mafia. So the ways in which high art and other kinds of forms interpenetrate one another has become very interesting. But again, thinking about looking behind the economics of some of these questions, I actually now was delighted to receive another book manuscript for a book that'll be out in the University of Michigan next year on the history of the art market. Excuse me, it's going to be an economic history of post-war art. So looking at market and other kinds of market-driven factors. So this collaboration was in fact paid for, in part at least, by the patron Virginia Dwan, some really important patrons of land art. And it turns out Tristan Parrich's grandmother. So some of you may have seen that Tristan Parrich released an incredible piece of music yesterday on None Such Records. I listened to it last night. And that circle of money, music, and influence is continuing to inform practice right now. And that's what I'm bent on studying.
Great, awesome. Thank you, Mike. And it's always exciting to have an author come back to us for a second book. So I'm excited I know you're working with my colleague Elizabeth on that next one, and I'm excited to keep seeing it. Yeah. All right. Oh, all right. So we have a question for Mike. I also want to try to get that question back to Carl because we didn't take a question break. So let's take that question for Carl first, and then if he could answer it quickly, and then we'll go over to Mike, and then we can wrap. So the question for Carl that came in earlier was that Charlie Parker battled with addiction much of his life. How do you see that part of his personal life as affecting his music beyond direct references such as Relaxing at Camarillo?
How do I see it affecting his life? Certainly his life became very, very chaotic. He was in kind of a day-to-day existence of an addict. And Charlie Parker, however, had a really bright light. His light really shone through his addiction. Charlie Parker expressed many, many different goals of what he wanted to do in the last years of his life. And many of them were very ambitious, very, very interesting. And I would say that his addiction prevented him from pursuing so many of his really ambitious goals, his musical goals. So I do think his addiction affected his last 5 years tremendously as an artist. And also I have to say that he continued to express himself forcefully and beautifully in the language he had established. Unfortunately, he had more to say to us and could not.
Thank you, Carl. And
Thank you.
Yeah, and I see that we don't actually have a question for Mike. Mimi had a comment for Mike about checking out Gavin Butts's new book. Mimi, did you want to say anything to Mike while we're all in the same room?
Yeah, sure. It was just a recommendation, that's all. It's just something that I recently read that I think you'd be really interested in. I don't think it's out yet, but it's coming soon.
I know his work. I've written a lot on Warhol, and yeah, there's a whole separate conversation that I would be delighted to continue with, not in the next 60 seconds.
Great. Well, on that note, thank you everybody for coming out. This was so cool to all be in the same room and to see you all talk to each other and think with each other. I really appreciate everyone making time to do this, especially in the middle of the day on Saturday. So I hope you all go do something really fun and relaxing. And I hope this is a beginning of many conversations among our authors at the press.